The text message arrived while I was selecting flowers for my son's casket. White lilies or yellow roses, the funeral director had asked, and I was trying to remember which ones Ethan had liked best when my phone buzzed with a credit card notification. Grand Paradise Resort Maldives, Premium Honeymoon Suite, $8,500. I stared at the notification, certain it was some kind of mistake. My husband Marcus was supposed to be at his mother's house, too distraught to help with the funeral arrangements. Too broken, he'd said, to look at caskets or choose burial plots for our 17-year-old son, but apparently not too broken to book a luxury honeymoon suite on an island 5,000 miles away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Chen, and I'm a pediatric surgeon at Boston Children's Medical Center. I've spent the last 15 years saving other people's children, performing miracles with a scalpel and steady hands. But I couldn't save my own son. Ethan had died in what the police called a tragic accident, a late-night crash on a rain-slicked road just 3 miles from our home in Brookline. He'd been driving back from his girlfriend Emma's house, a route he'd taken hundreds of times before. The investigators said he'd lost control on a curve, hit a tree at 60 miles per hour. No drugs, no alcohol, no explanation except the rain and maybe a moment's distraction. I'd been the one to identify his body. Marcus had collapsed in the hospital hallway when we got the call, unable to face what had happened. So I'd walked into that cold room alone, my surgical training keeping me clinical and composed even as my world shattered. Yes, I'd told the medical examiner, that's my son. Yes, those are his distinctive green eyes, the small scar on his chin from when he fell off his bike at age 7. Yes, that's the class ring we'd given him just 6 months ago. Now 5 days later, I stood in Whitehall Funeral Home, trying to make decisions no parent should ever have to make, while my husband of 20 years was apparently planning a tropical getaway. I looked at the funeral director, Miss Garrison, who was waiting patiently for my flower decision, and forced myself to focus. Yellow roses, I said finally. Ethan always said they reminded him of sunshine. He used to pick them from our neighbor's garden when he was little, before he understood about property boundaries. Miss Patterson would pretend to be upset, but she always let him keep them. Mr. Garrison made a note in his leather portfolio, his expression professionally sympathetic. He'd guided dozens of grieving parents through this process. I could tell his movements were practiced, his voice calibrated to provide comfort without intrusion. But he couldn't know that while I was selecting flowers for my dead son, I was simultaneously processing the implications of that credit card charge. The Grand Paradise Resort wasn't just any hotel. I knew because Marcus and I had looked at it for our 20th anniversary last year. We'd ultimately decided it was too expensive, too indulgent when we were saving for Ethan's college tuition. Harvard had been his dream, pre-med like his mother, though he'd talked about pediatric oncology rather than surgery. He wanted to save the kids. I couldn't, he'd said. Now that tuition money would never be spent, and apparently Marcus had decided to splurge after all. Would you like to select the casket today, or would you prefer to wait for your husband? Mr. Garrison asked gently. I'll choose today, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. My husband is indisposed. We moved to the casket showroom, a surreal space where polished wood and gleaming metal tried to provide dignity to the unbearable. I selected a simple mahogany casket with brass handles, imagining Ethan's reaction to the pompous display. He would have laughed, made some joke about Egyptian pharaohs or vampire movies. He'd inherited my dark humor, the coping mechanism that got us through difficult days at the hospital. My phone buzzed again. Another credit card alert. Tiffany & Co. An engagement ring. No, I realized with a sick feeling. Marcus and I had been married too long for engagement rings. This was something else. A gift for someone else. I excused myself to the funeral home's bathroom, locked the door, and pulled up our credit card app. The charges were all there, a digital trail of betrayal laid out in neat chronological order. The resort booking was just the latest. Over the past 3 days, while I'd been drowning in grief and funeral arrangements, Marcus had also purchased first-class tickets to the Maldives for two, designer luggage from Nordstrom, and now jewelry from Tiffany. My surgical hands, so steady in the operating room, shook as I scrolled through the charges. How could he be planning a honeymoon while our son lay in a morgue? Who was this woman he was taking to paradise while I picked out burial clothes for the child we'd created together? I returned to Miss Garrison and finished the arrangements with mechanical precision. Burial plot in Mount Auburn Cemetery, the section with the old oak trees that Ethan had loved climbing as a child. Service at our family church, St. Catherine's, where he'd been baptized and confirmed. Reception at our home, because Ethan would have wanted people to remember him somewhere, filled with life, not in some sterile funeral home parlor. The total came to just over $30,000. I signed the papers without flinching. Money felt meaningless now, just numbers on a page. What did it matter when my son was gone and my husband was planning a romantic escape with another woman? I drove home through the Boston afternoon traffic, my mind racing. Marcus's car wasn't in the driveway, which didn't surprise me. He'd been largely absent since Ethan's death, claiming he needed space to process his grief. I'd believed him, had even felt guilty for handling my own grief so differently. While he'd retreated, I'd thrown myself into action, making lists, handling logistics, doing what needed to be done. I'd assumed we were just grieving in our own ways. Our house felt like a museum of our former life. Ethan's backpack still sat by the front door where he'd dropped it after school that final day. His Nike sneakers were kicked off beside it, tongues lolling out the way that always annoyed Marcus. The mail had piled up on the entry table, sympathy cards mixed with college brochures that would never be opened. I walked through the rooms like a detective at a crime scene, seeing our life with new eyes. The family photos on the mantel showed 20 years of apparent happiness. Marcus and me on our wedding day, both of us so young and certain of our future. Ethan as a baby, a toddler, a gap-toothed first grader. Family vacations to Disney World, the Grand Canyon, Martha's Vineyard. In every photo we looked like the perfect family. Had it all been a lie? In Marcus's home office I found more evidence. He'd been sloppy, or maybe he just didn't care anymore. His laptop was open, his email still logged in. The messages were right there in his sent folder. No attempt to hide them. Emails to someone named Sophia Reeves, messages that made my stomach turn. I can't wait to start our new life together. He'd written just yesterday. After everything is settled here, we can finally be free. The house in Maui is perfect. Just like you dreamed. House in Maui. I sank into his desk chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. How long had this been going on? How deep did this betrayal go? I searched for Sophia Reeves online and found her immediately. Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, all public profiles showing a stunning woman in her early 30s, a real estate agent specializing in luxury properties. Her Instagram was full of beach photos, yoga poses, and inspirational quotes about living your truth and following your heart. The most recent post, from just 6 hours ago, showed a jewelry box from Tiffany, with the caption, "Sometimes the universe sends you exactly what you need exactly when you need it. Blessed, new beginnings, love win." The comments below were from her friends congratulating her, heart emojis and champagne glasses. One comment stopped me cold. "So happy you finally found your soulmate. After everything you've been through, you deserve this happiness." After everything she'd been through. What about what I was going through? What about our son, cold and alone in a funeral home? I heard the garage door open and quickly closed the laptop. Marcus was home. I stayed in his office, listening to his footsteps in the kitchen, the refrigerator opening, the clink of a beer bottle. Such normal sounds for such an abnormal moment. "Victoria," his voice called out. "Are you home?" "In your office," I replied, surprised by how calm I sounded. He appeared in the doorway looking haggard but not, I noticed now, truly devastated. His grief seemed performed, like an actor who'd studied sadness, but never truly felt it. How had I not seen this before? Or had losing Ethan simply stripped away my ability to ignore what had always been there? How did it go at the funeral home? He asked. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Not quite meeting my eyes. Fine. Everything's arranged for Saturday. I watched his face carefully. The flowers, the casket, the burial plot, all chosen and paid for while you were. Where exactly? He shifted uncomfortably. I told you. I was at my mother's. I just needed some time. Your mother. I pulled out my phone and showed him the credit card alert. In the Maldives. That's an interesting new location for your mother's house. The color drained from his face. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, like a fish gasping for air. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us crackled with 20 years of marriage collapsing in real time. I can explain. He finally managed. Please do. I'd love to hear how you explain booking a honeymoon suite while I was choosing our son's casket. I'd love to understand the logic of buying diamond jewelry while I was selecting burial plots. Please, Marcus, explain it to me. He sank into the chair across from his desk, suddenly looking older than his 45 years. You don't understand, Victoria. This isn't what it looks like. I laughed. A harsh sound that didn't sound like me. It looks like you're planning to run away to a tropical paradise with your mistress less than a week after our son died. Please tell me how it's different from that. The timing is horrible. I know. But Sophia and we've been planning this for months, before Ethan, before the accident. We were going to wait until after his graduation to tell you. We wanted to minimize the disruption to his life. The words hit me like physical blows. Months. They'd been planning this for months. While I'd been performing surgeries, saving other people's children, coming home to what I thought was my family, Marcus had been planning his escape with a woman 13 years younger than me. You were going to leave us, I said slowly, the full reality sinking. You were going to abandon your family. Not abandon, Marcus protested weakly. I would have still been Ethan's father. We would have worked out custody, visitation. I wasn't going to just disappear. But Ethan's gone now, I continued, understanding flooding through me like ice water. So there's no custody to work out, no visitation to schedule, nothing keeping you here. Marcus's silence was answer enough. The man I'd loved for 2 decades, the father of my child, had been marking time until he could leave us, and now that our son was dead, he was free. How long? I asked. How long have you been seeing her? 2 years, he admitted quietly. We met at that medical conference in San Diego, the one you couldn't attend because of Ethan's basketball championship. I remembered that weekend. I'd stayed home to watch Ethan play in the state semifinals, cheering from the stands as he scored the winning basket. Marcus had gone to the conference alone, claiming he needed the continuing education credit. I'd been so proud of being the parent who showed up, who prioritized our son's moments over career obligations, all while my husband was starting an affair that would eventually destroy our family. 2 years of lies, I said. 2 years of coming home to us while planning a life with her. Did you ever love us at all? Of course I loved you, Marcus said. But even that was past tense. I still love Ethan. His death, it's killing me too. Victoria, is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like his death is pretty convenient for you. No messy custody battle, no child support, no having to explain to your son why daddy's leaving, mommy for a woman who posts motivational quotes on Instagram. That's not fair, Marcus protested. You think I wanted this? You think I'm not devastated? I don't know what you are anymore. I stood up, needing to move, to put distance between us. But I know what you're not. You're not the man I thought I married. You're not the father I thought Ethan had, and you're definitely not the grieving parent you've been pretending to be. My phone rang, interrupting whatever Marcus was going to say next. It was Emma, Ethan's girlfriend. I'd been checking on her daily since the accident, knowing she was struggling with grief and guilt about their last conversation. They'd had a small argument that night about college plans, nothing serious, but she'd been torturing herself with what if. Hi, Emma, I answered, turning away from Marcus. How are you doing today, Mrs. Chen? Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. I need to tell you something about the night Ethan died. I've been trying to work up the courage, but I can't keep it inside anymore. What is it, sweetheart? I kept my voice gentle, Dr. Calm, even as my pulse quickened. There was someone following him that night. Ethan called me when he left my house, like he always did. He said a car had been behind him since he pulled out of my driveway. He was joking at first, saying maybe it was the CIA, or something, but then he got quiet. He said the car was getting closer, driving really aggressively. My blood turned to ice. Emma, did he say anything else? Did he describe the car? He said it was a dark SUV, maybe blue or black. He couldn't tell in the rain. And then, she paused, sobbing. Then I heard the crash. The phone went dead. I called 911, but they said someone had already reported it. I should have told the police about the car, but I was in shock and I thought maybe I'd misunderstood. Emma, listen to me, I interrupted, using my firm doctor voice. This is not your fault. You did nothing wrong, but I need you to tell the police exactly what you just told me. Can you do that? After I hung up with Emma, I turned back to Marcus, who had gone pale, a dark SUV, following our son, running him off the road. This wasn't an accident, was it? I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus said, but his hands were shaking. I pulled out my phone and began searching through Ethan's social media, something I'd been unable to do since his death. His last post was from the day he died, a photo of him and Emma at a coffee shop. But as I scrolled back through the previous weeks, I found something that made my heart stop. 3 weeks before his death, Ethan had posted a screenshot of a text conversation. The number wasn't saved in his phone, but the message was clear. Your father needs to make the right choice. Tell him he's running out of time. I showed the screen to Marcus, whose face had gone from pale to gray. What choice, Marcus? What were you supposed to do? He buried his face in his hands. And for the first time since Ethan's death, I saw him truly break down. But these weren't the tears of a grieving father. These were the tears of a guilty man, whose secrets were finally catching up with him. It started as a mistake, he said through his tears. I was going to leave the practice, start fresh with Sophia in Hawaii. But there were complications with the partnership agreement, financial obligations I couldn't get out of. So I made a deal with some people who could make those problems go away. What kind of people? But even as I asked, I was beginning to understand the shape of this horror. The expensive gifts to Sophia, the house in Maui, the sudden ability to book $8,000 honeymoon suites. Where had the money come from? They said they just needed someone with my credentials, my reputation, to sign off on some prescriptions. Nothing serious, they said. Just some pain management paperwork. I thought it would be a few scripts and then I'd be free. Opioids, I said flatly. You were writing false prescriptions for drug dealers. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I could pay off the partnership buyout. But once they had me, they wouldn't let go. They kept demanding more scripts, more pills. They said if I stopped, they'd expose everything. I'd lose my license, go to prison. Sophia would leave me, and Ethan found out. It wasn't a question. Our brilliant son, planning to be a doctor himself, had discovered his father's criminal activities. Marcus nodded miserably. He confronted me 3 weeks ago, said he'd found some prescriptions in my office that didn't make sense. Hundreds of pills prescribed to patients who didn't exist. He was so disappointed. Victoria, the way he looked at me. So they killed him. I said it calmly, clinically, the same tone I used to deliver terminal diagnosis. They killed our son because you were trying to get out of your deal. I told them I needed more time, that I'd convince him to stay quiet. But Ethan, you know how he was about doing the right thing. He said if I didn't turn myself in, he would do it for me. He gave me a deadline. The night he died was the night it expired. The full monstrosity of it washed over me. While I'd been at the hospital saving lives, my husband had been destroying them. While I'd been raising our son to have integrity and compassion, his father had been modeling corruption and cowardice, and when forced to choose between his criminal associates and his own child, Marcus had chosen self-preservation.
You let them kill him, I said, my voice barely above a whisper.
You knew they were going to do something. And you let him drive to Emma's house anyway. I thought I had more time. I thought I could fix it. I never imagined they would. He couldn't finish the sentence. I stood up slowly, my movements careful and deliberate. 20 years of marriage, 17 years of parenthood, a lifetime of trust and partnership, all of it, ashes now. The man sitting across from me wasn't my husband, he was my son's killer, as surely as if he'd run Ethan off that road himself. "I'm going to the police," I said. "I'm going to tell them everything Emma told me, show them Ethan's social media posts, and let them investigate. And Marcus, I suggest you use that honeymoon reservation. Run to your paradise with Sophia, because when the police start looking into this, when they connect your prescriptions to Ethan's death, you're going to prison for a very long time. Victoria, please." He started to beg, but I was already walking away. I went to Ethan's room and sat on his bed, surrounded by the artifacts of his interrupted life. Basketball trophies, science fair medals, acceptance letters from colleges he'd never attend. On his desk was a photo from last Christmas, the three of us in front of the tree. We looked so happy, so complete. But even then, Marcus had been living his double life, counting down to his escape. My phone buzzed with another credit card alert. Marcus was booking additional flights, moving up the departure date. Good. Let him run. Let him spend whatever time he had left with his Instagram princess in their tropical paradise. Because I knew something he didn't yet realize, there was no paradise far enough to escape what he'd done. I pulled out my phone and called Detective Morrison, the officer who'd handled Ethan's accident investigation. "I have new information about my son's death," I said when he answered. "It wasn't an accident, and I can prove it." As I waited for the detective to arrive, I sat in Ethan's room planning a different kind of funeral. Not just for my son, but for the life I'd thought I had, the marriage I'd believed in, the man I'd loved who had never really existed. The funeral would go on as planned. On Saturday, I would bury my child with all the love and dignity he deserved. But I would also bury the lies, the betrayal, and the blindness that had cost him his life. Marcus thought he was escaping to paradise. But I was going to make sure he spent the rest of his life in the hell he'd created. For Ethan, who'd had the courage to stand up to his father even when it cost him everything. For all the families destroyed by the pills Marcus had illegally prescribed. And for the woman I'd been, who'd trusted too easily and seen too late. The detective's car pulled into our driveway just as the sun was setting, painting the sky the same amber gold as Ethan's favorite roses. I took one last look at the family photo on his desk, then went downstairs to begin the process of justice. My son was gone, but his integrity lived on in the truth I was about to tell. And that, I realized, was the only eulogy that really mattered. Detective Morrison arrived with 2 other officers and a forensics team. They transformed our home into a crime scene. Not for a murder that had happened here, but for evidence of the conspiracy that had led to one. I watched them bag Marcus's laptop, his files, the prescription pads he'd hidden in his locked desk drawer. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of our former life. "Mrs. Chen," Detective Morrison said after I'd told him everything. His weathered face grave. "We're going to need you to come to the station to make a formal statement. And we'll need to speak with Emma Patterson as well." I nodded, already reaching for my phone to text Emma's mother. The girl had been carrying this burden alone for days, too afraid and traumatized to speak up. Now she would have the chance to help bring justice for the boy she'd loved. "Before we go," the detective continued, "is your husband still in the house?" "No," I replied. "He left about an hour ago, probably heading to the airport." I showed him the credit card alerts on my phone, the trail of purchases leading to paradise. Detective Morrison immediately got on his radio, calling in Marcus's description and license plate. "We'll put out an APB," he assured me. He won't get far. But I wasn't so sure. Marcus had had 2 years to plan his escape. 2 years of deception that I'd never suspected. Who knew what other preparations he'd made? What other identities he might have created? The man I'd thought was a dedicated physician, a loving father, had turned out to be someone capable of sacrificing his own son for his freedom. What else was he capable of? At the police station, I spent hours going through every detail. Emma arrived with her parents, her face pale but determined. She told her story again, this time to a room full of detectives and a stenographer. The fear in Ethan's voice during that last phone call, the aggressive pursuit by the dark SUV, the sound of the crash that had cut off his words mid-sentence. I held her hand as she spoke, the 17-year-old girl who'd loved my son, and now had to relive his final moments for strangers. Her parents sat on her other side, their faces etched with the same question that haunted me. How had we not seen this coming? The medical board will be notified immediately, Detective Morrison explained after we'd finished our statement. Every prescription your husband wrote in the last 2 years will be investigated. We'll need your help identifying legitimate patients versus fraudulent ones. Of course, I agreed. Though the task felt monumental. How many pills had Marcus put on the street? How many families had been destroyed by his greed? And all for what? A younger woman in a house in Maui. As I was leaving the station, my phone rang. It was Dr. Patricia Nolan, the chief of staff at the hospital where both Marcus and I had privileges. Victoria. I just heard from the police. I'm so sorry. I don't even have words. Neither do I, Patricia. Listen. Whatever you need, the hospital is here for you. Time off, counseling services, legal support, and Victoria. We're reviewing all of Marcus's hospital prescriptions as well. If he was doing this through his private practice, we need to make sure he wasn't using hospital resources too. The implications kept expanding like ripples in a pond. Every institution Marcus had been affiliated with would now be under scrutiny. Every colleague who'd worked with him would be questioned. The damage wasn't just to our family, it was to an entire community that had trusted him. I drove home through empty streets. The city quiet at 3 in the morning, but when I turned onto our street, I saw immediately that something was wrong. Every light in our house was on, the front door standing open like a wound. I pulled over a block away and called 911, my hands shaking as I reported a possible break-in. The dispatcher told me to stay in my car to wait for police. But I could see shadows moving inside my home, inside Ethan's room. The patrol cars arrived within minutes. Officers approaching the house with weapons drawn. I waited, my heart pounding as they entered. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, an officer emerged and waved me over. The house was ransacked, every drawer pulled out, every cushion overturned, every file scattered across the floor. But it was Ethan's room that made me gasp. His computer was gone. His phone, which I'd kept charging on his nightstand like some kind of digital shrine, was missing. Even his school notebooks had been rifled through. They were looking for something specific. The officer said, "Any idea what evidence?" I realized. Ethan had confronted Marcus about the prescriptions. He must have had proof, documents, maybe screenshots. Something concrete that he'd planned to take to the authorities. And now, someone was trying to find and destroy it. But they didn't know my son. Ethan had inherited my methodical nature, my tendency to over-prepare. If he'd found evidence of his father's crimes, he wouldn't have kept it in obvious places. He would have been smarter than that. "I need to check something," I told the officer. In the garage, behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old camping equipment, was Ethan's childhood safe. He'd gotten it for his 10th birthday, thrilled by the digital lock and the responsibility of having his own secure space. Over the years, he'd kept different treasures in it. Baseball cards, birthday money, his first love letter from a middle school crush. The safe was untouched, hidden behind a stack of boxes, labeled winter clothes. I input the combination, Ethan's birthday backwards. A code he'd never changed, despite my suggestions about password security. Inside, along with his passport and some savings bonds from his grandparents, was a USB drive, labeled insurance. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Even facing death, my 17-year-old son had thought to protect evidence, to create insurance. He'd been braver than his father, more ethical than the man who'd raised him. Or maybe I'd been the one who'd raised him, really. Maybe that's why he'd chosen justice over self-preservation. We'll need to take that as evidence, the officer said gently, but we'll make copies for you first. Your son may have just given us what we need to take down the entire operation. I handed over the USB drive. This final gift from my child. Ethan had known the danger he was in, had prepared for the possibility that something might happen to him. At 17, he'd shown more courage and foresight than I'd managed in 43 years of life. The police secured the house and posted an officer outside, but I couldn't stay there. Every room held memories, now tainted by betrayal. I packed a bag and checked into a hotel near the hospital. A sterile space where I could think without the weight of history pressing down on me. The next morning brought a cascade of revelation. The USB drive contained everything. Screenshots of suspicious prescriptions, text messages between Marcus and unknown numbers discussing distribution, even audio recordings of phone conversation. Ethan had been building a case for weeks, documenting his father's crimes with the thoroughness of a prosecutor, but there was more. The financial forensics team had started tracing Marcus's money, and what they found was staggering. The house in Maui that he'd mentioned to Sophia didn't exist, at least not as a purchased property. The money he'd been flashing around, the expensive gifts, the luxury travel plans, it was all funded by his illegal prescription scheme. He'd been paid nearly $500,000 over 2 years for providing fake prescriptions to a drug ring that operated across New England. And Sophia Reeves, she wasn't just his mistress, she was his handler. The FBI joined the investigation that morning, taking over what had started as a local police matter. Agent Rachel Wu, a woman about my age with sharp eyes and an economy of movement that reminded me of my surgical colleagues, laid out what they'd discovered. Sophia Reeves isn't her real name, Agent Wu explained, spreading photos across the conference table. Her real name is Sophia Volkov. She's been on our radar for 3 years as part of a pharmaceutical fraud ring that targets medical professionals. Her MO is always the same: seduce doctors or pharmacists who have financial problems or personal vulnerabilities, then leverage the relationship to get them writing prescriptions. I stared at the photos of the woman I'd thought had stolen my husband. Now I saw her differently. Not as a rival but as a predator who'd identified Marcus as weak and exploitable. The yoga poses and inspirational quotes had all been part of a carefully crafted persona designed to appeal to middle-aged men looking for escape. Your husband wasn't her first, Agent Wu continued. She's done this at least 4 times that we know of. 2 of the previous doctors committed suicide when the schemes collapsed. 1 is in federal prison. The 4th disappeared completely, probably dead. And Marcus thought he was special, I said bitterly. Thought she actually loved him. They always do. That's what makes her so effective. She makes them believe they're starting a new life, that she's their salvation. By the time they realize the truth, they're in too deep to get out. Where is she now? I asked. That's what we're trying to determine. She went dark the same night as your husband. They may be together, or she may have eliminated him as a liability. These people don't leave loose ends. The idea that Marcus might already be dead should have affected me more than it did, but I felt nothing except a cold determination to see justice done for Ethan. Whether Marcus faced trial or had already met his fate at the hands of his criminal associates seemed almost irrelevant. He'd made his choices, my son hadn't been given one. The funeral proceeded as planned that Saturday. The church was packed, not just with family and friends, but with Ethan's classmates, teachers, coaches, and teammates. Emma spoke beautifully about the boy who'd tutored her in chemistry and made her laugh with his terrible pun. His basketball coach talked about Ethan's dedication and team spirit. His AP biology teacher read from an essay Ethan had written about wanting to become a doctor to honor his mother's legacy. I spoke last standing at the pulpit where Ethan had been confirmed just 2 years earlier. I didn't mention Marcus, who was still missing, despite a nationwide manhunt. I didn't talk about the investigation or the truth about Ethan's death. Instead, I talked about my son's integrity, his courage in standing up for what was right even when it cost him everything. Ethan believed that doing the right thing wasn't a choice, I said, looking out at the sea of faces. It was an obligation. He couldn't see injustice and remain silent. He couldn't know about harm being done and not try to stop it. That moral clarity, that unwavering compass, defined who he was. It's what made him extraordinary, and ultimately it's what we should all remember and try to emulate. As we processed the cemetery, I noticed unmarked cars following the funeral procession. The FBI was watching, hoping Marcus might risk appearing at his son's burial, but he didn't come. Either he was too well hidden or too dead to pay his final respects. At the graveside, as they lowered my son's casket into the ground, Emma pressed something into my hand. It was a letter, Ethan's handwriting on notebook paper. "He gave this to me a week before he died," she whispered. "He said, if anything happened to him, I should give it to you. I'm sorry I didn't give it to you sooner. I was scared. I waited until everyone had left, until it was just me and the fresh earth covering my child before I opened the letter." "Mom," it began, "if you're reading this, then I guess I wasn't as careful as I thought. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a lot of things, for not telling you sooner about Dad, for putting you in danger by confronting him, for not being there to help you through whatever comes next. But I'm not sorry for trying to stop him." Every day he continued writing those prescriptions. More people got hurt. Kids at my school talk about pill parties, about how easy it is to get oxy and perks. "I've seen what happens to them, Mom. Remember when Jake Morrison overdosed last year? His pills came from prescriptions," Dad wrote. "I traced them back. Jake's still alive, but barely. He'll never play football again, never go to college, and Dad did that. Our father did that. I know you'll blame yourself for not seeing it sooner. Don't. Dad was good at hiding things. He had us both fooled, but now you know and you'll do what needs to be done. You always do. I love you, Mom. Take care of yourself, and remember what you always told me. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. Don't do nothing. All my love, Ethan." I sat by his grave until the sun set, holding that letter and crying for the son who'd been wise beyond his years and brave beyond measure. When I finally stood to leave, I noticed a figure watching from across the cemetery. My heart jumped, thinking it might be Marcus. But as the person stepped into the fading light, I saw it was someone else entirely. The woman was probably in her 50s, well-dressed but haggard, as if she'd been beautiful once but life had worn her down. She approached slowly, cautiously, like someone afraid of being rejected. "Dr. Chen," she said softly, "I'm Linda Harrison. I think your husband killed my daughter." The words hung in the air between us, another piece of the horror clicking into place. I knew the name Harrison. Melody Harrison, aged 19, had died of an opioid overdose 8 months ago. It had been in the news because she'd been a promising nursing student, with no history of drug use. "Tell me," I said simply, and she did. "Standing in that cemetery surrounded by the dead, Linda Harrison told me how her daughter had gotten hooked on painkillers after a car accident, how she'd tried to get clean, but couldn't find help, how she'd turned to street pills when her legitimate prescriptions ran out, how those street pills had been laced with fentanyl. The police traced the pills back to prescriptions," Linda said, tears streaming down her face. "But the prescriptions were fake, written to people who didn't exist. We tried to investigate, but the trail went cold, until I saw the news about your husband, about what he'd been doing." "I'm so sorry," I said, the words inadequate but necessary. "I'm sorry too, for your boy. He tried to stop it, didn't he? Tried to save kids like my Melody." "Yes, he tried." We stood together, two mothers bound by loss, by the ripple effects of one man's greed, and I knew there would be others, other parents, other children, other families destroyed by those fake prescriptions. The $500,000 Marcus had been paid represented thousands of pills, hundreds of destroyed lives. "There's going to be a support group," Linda said, after a while, "for families affected by this. The FBI suggested it, said it might help with the investigation, but also with healing. Will you come?" "I will," I promised, "and I'll bring everything I know, every record, every piece of evidence. We'll make sure everyone knows what really happened." That night, back in my hotel room, I got a call from Agent Wu, "We found him," she said without preamble. My heart stopped. "Alive?" "Yeah, barely. Someone worked him over pretty badly before dumping him at a hospital in Montreal. He's stable enough to transport back to Boston. He'll be arraigned tomorrow if you want to attend." "Did he say anything about Ethan? About why he let it happen?" "He's not talking yet," lawyered up immediately. "But Dr. Chen, we also found Sofia Volkov. She was trying to board a flight to Moscow. She had 4 different passports and over 200,000 in cash. She's being held without bail." The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was mixed with something else, a desire to face these people, to look them in the eye and make them understand what they'd taken from me, from Ethan, from all the families they'd destroyed. "There's something else," Agent Wu continued. "We've identified at least 6 other doctors in the network, all of them recruited the same way, all of them writing illegal prescriptions. Your son's evidence is helping us unravel the entire operation. He may have saved hundreds of lives, but not his own," I thought bitterly. My brave, brilliant boy had saved everyone except himself. The next morning, I sat in a federal courtroom and watched as they brought Marcus in. He was in a wheelchair, his face bruised and swollen, his left arm in a cast. Whatever his associates had done to him, it had been thorough, but I felt no sympathy. He was alive, which was more than our son got. He looked at me once, his eyes pleading for something. Forgiveness? Understanding? I stared back, letting him see nothing but the cold fury that had replaced my grief. He looked away first. The charges were read: conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, healthcare fraud, money laundering, and felony murder for Ethan's death. The prosecution argued that by continuing his illegal activities despite clear threats to his son's life, Marcus had directly contributed to Ethan's murder. The judge agreed, denying bail and calling Marcus a flight risk and a danger to the community. As they led him away, Marcus tried once more to catch my eye. This time I was the one who looked away. I had more important things to focus on than the man who'd betrayed everything our family had stood for. Outside the courthouse, Linda Harrison was waiting with a small group of other people, parents, siblings, spouses, all connected by loss, all victims of the prescription drug epidemic that Marcus had helped fuel. "Dr. Chen," one of them said, a young man who couldn't have been much older than Ethan, "I wanted to thank you, and your son. My sister is alive because of what he did. She got help when the news broke, finally admitted where she was getting her pills. She's in rehab now." Others shared similar stories. Children who'd come forward about their drug use when they learned about the criminal network. Parents who'd finally understood why their kids had been acting strange. Lives saved because one 17-year-old boy had refused to stay silent. "We're calling ourselves Ethan's Army," Linda said. "If you're okay with that, we want to continue what he started. Push for better prescription monitoring, more accountability for doctors, more resources for addiction treatment. Make sure this never happens again." I thought about Ethan's letter, about his insistence that good people couldn't do nothing in the face of evil. He would have loved the idea of an army fighting in his name, continuing the battle he'd started. He would be honored. I said, "And so am I." 6 months later, I stood in a packed auditorium at the state capitol, testifying before a legislative committee about prescription drug reform. Ethan's Law, as they were calling it, would create the strictest prescription monitoring system in the country, requiring real-time reporting and AI-assisted pattern recognition to identify potential fraud. My son was 17 years old. I told the lawmaker he wanted to be a doctor, to save lives like I do. Instead, he died trying to stop his father from destroying lives. He died because our current system made it too easy for corrupt doctors to flood our communities with dangerous drugs. Ethan's Law won't bring my son back, but it might save yours. The law passed unanimously. Other states began drafting similar legislation. Medical schools started adding mandatory ethics courses, focused on the opioid crisis and prescription responsibility. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was some. Marcus was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He'd finally confessed everything in exchange for protective custody. terrified of what his former associates might do to him in general population. He sent me letters that I never opened, messages through lawyers that I ignored. He was dead to me in every way that mattered. Sofia Volkov got 40 years. During her trial, the full scope of her manipulations came out. She'd been trained by Russian intelligence in psychological manipulation before turning to crime. She'd viewed American doctors as easy marks, soft and susceptible to flattery. Marcus had been particularly easy, she testified, desperate for admiration and validation. She'd played him like a violin, she said, and seemed proud of it. But the real victory came when the FBI used Ethan's evidence and our continued investigation to dismantle the entire network. 53 people were arrested, over $1 million in assets were seized, drug supplies dried up in communities across New England, overdose rates dropped for the first time in years. I returned to surgery, finding solace in the precision of the operating room, the ability to fix what was broken in children's bodies if not in the world. My colleagues were supportive, my patients unaware of my story unless they recognized my name from the news. In the OR, I was just Dr. Chen, steady hands and clear decisions, saving lives one surgery at a time. Emma started pre-med at Boston University, inspired, she said, by Ethan's courage and my strength. She volunteered with Ethan's army, speaking at high schools about the dangers of prescription drugs and the importance of speaking up when something seems wrong. I watched her grow from a grieving teenager into a fierce advocate, and I saw Ethan's spirit living on in her determination. The house in Brookline stood empty for months before I finally had the strength to deal with it. Going through 20 years of accumulated life was like performing surgery on my own heart. Every room held memories, Ethan taking his first steps in the living room, learning to ride his bike in the driveway, doing homework at the kitchen table while I cooked dinner, and Marcus pretended to help. But there were other memories too, ones I could now see clearly. Marcus staying late at his office more and more frequently, mysterious phone calls he'd take in private, the way he'd started criticizing my appearance, my dedication to work, preparing to justify his eventual abandonment. The signs had been there, but I'd been too trusting, too busy, too in love with the life I thought we had to see them. I donated most of Marcus's things to charity, but I kept Ethan's room exactly as it was, not as a shrine but as a reminder of the boy who'd chosen integrity over safety, who'd stood up to his father knowing the danger, who'd prepared evidence, even as he faced death. 1 year after Ethan's death, I received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Morrison, the detective who'd first investigated the crash, came to my office at the hospital. He was retiring, he said, but wanted to tell me something first. "Your son saved my grandson," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Danny was buying pills from the same network. Good kid. Honor student. Got hooked after a sports injury. When this all came out, when he learned where his pills really came from, that a kid his age died trying to stop it, it shook him. He got clean, Dr. Chen. He's a year sober now, heading to college in the fall." He handed me a photo of a young man in a cap and gown, smiling broadly at graduation. On the back was written, "For Ethan's mom, with gratitude. None of this would have been possible without your son's courage." I kept that photo on my desk next to one of Ethan, two boys who'd never meet, but whose lives were forever connected. One who'd died trying to do right, one who'd lived because of it. It wasn't a fair trade, would never be a fair trade, but it was proof that Ethan's death had meant something. The support group Linda Harrison had started grew into a national organization. We met monthly, sharing stories and strategies, lobbying for stronger laws and better treatment options. Some nights it felt like emptying the ocean with a teaspoon. Other nights, when a parent shared that their child had gotten help or a sibling reported their loved one was in recovery, it felt like changing the world. I began speaking at medical schools, telling Ethan's story to future doctors. I talked about the slippery slope of compromise, the way small ethical violations could snowball into life-destroying crimes. I showed them Marcus's mugshot and Ethan's graduation photo side by side. Two futures, I'd say, one destroyed by greed, one destroyed by integrity. Choose carefully. The students always asked the same question: how do you forgive him? Meaning Marcus. The answer was simple: I didn't. Forgiveness implied understanding, acceptance, Moving on, I would never understand how Marcus could have chosen money over our son's life. I would never accept that Ethan had to die for his father's sins, and I would never move on from the mission my son had started, but I had moved forward. Not into happiness exactly, but into every prescription monitored through Ethan's law, every young person who chose recovery over addiction, every family spared the grief I carried. These were Ethan's legacy. He'd wanted to be a doctor to save lives. In the end, he'd saved more lives than most doctors ever would. 3 years after Ethan's death, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell our story. I agreed, but only if it focused on the larger issue of prescription drug fraud and the need for systemic change. The film, The Boy Who Said No, premiered at Sundance and won several awards. More importantly, it reached millions of people who'd never heard of Ethan or understood how easily prescription drugs could destroy families. At the premiere, I sat between Emma and Linda Harrison, surrounded by other members of Ethan's army. On screen, actors recreated my son's final weeks, his discovery of his father's crimes, his courage in confronting them. It was painful to watch, but necessary. The world needed to see who Ethan was, what he'd stood for, why he'd died. When the film ended, the real Marcus appeared on screen in footage from a prison interview. He looked older, grayer, diminished. He spoke about his crimes, his choices, his regrets. But when asked about Ethan, he broke down completely. "I destroyed everything good in my life," he said through tears. "My son was the best person I knew, and I let him die, because I was too weak to stand up to the people I'd gotten involved with. I have to live with that every day. It's a life sentence worse than any prison." I felt nothing watching him cry. His tears were as meaningless as his wedding vows had been, as false as the life we'd built together. The only truth Marcus had ever told was in those prescriptions he'd signed, each one a confession of greed over ethics, self over family. The film's impact was immediate and far-reaching. Medical schools began using it in ethics courses. Recovery programs showed it to illustrate the human cost of the drug trade. Parents watched it with their teenagers, starting difficult conversations about prescription drugs and the pressure to stay silent about wrongdoing. But for me, the most meaningful response came from other young people who'd discovered family members involved in illegal activities. They reached out through Ethan's army, seeking guidance on how to handle their impossible situation. We created a hotline, staffed by counselors and lawyers, offering support and protection for whistleblowers. We called it Ethan's Line, and in its first year, it helped expose 17 different fraud schemes and protected dozens of young people who'd chosen to speak up. Each success felt like a small victory in the war Ethan had started. But each one also reminded me of the price he'd paid for his integrity. On his birthday, I always visited his grave, bringing yellow roses and updates on all the lives he'd saved. I'd tell him about Emma's progress in medical school, about the new laws passed in his name, about the families reunited through recovery. I never told him about Marcus. There was nothing to say about the man who'd failed him so completely. Marcus existed now only as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how greed and weakness could destroy everything good in life. He'd wanted paradise with a younger woman and a fresh start. Instead, he'd created a hell that would trap him forever. The investigation revealed that Marcus had made his final choice the night Ethan died. Phone records showed he'd received a call from his handlers. An hour before Ethan left Emma's house, they'd told him the problem would be handled, and Marcus had done nothing. He'd sat in our home knowing his son was in danger, and chosen silence. When the call came about the accident, he'd known immediately it was no accident. His tears had been real, but they were tears of guilt, not just grief. I learned this detail during the trial but kept it from everyone, except Agent Wu. There was no point in adding to the horror, no benefit in sharing the full depth of Marcus's betrayal. It was enough that justice had been served, that the network had been destroyed, that other families had been spared our fate. 5 years after Ethan's death, I stood in the same auditorium where I'd testified about Ethan's law, but this time I was receiving an award. The National Medical Ethics Foundation was honoring the work of Ethan's army in preventing prescription fraud and supporting affected families. As I accepted the award, I thought about the 17-year-old boy who'd started it all with his refusal to stay silent. In my acceptance speech, I talked about the courage it takes to speak truth to power, especially when that power is held by someone you love. I talked about the responsibility of medical professionals to first do no harm, and how that extended beyond their patients to their community. And I talked about hope, the hope that comes from seeing young people like Ethan choose integrity even when it costs them everything. The award itself was beautiful, crystal etched with words from Ethan's letter. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. But more meaningful than the award were the people in the audience. Families who'd found recovery through our programs, medical students who'd taken pledges to prescribe responsibly, legislators who'd passed stronger oversight laws, and Emma, now Dr. Emma Patterson, who'd specialized in addiction medicine and was running a clinic for young people struggling with prescription drug abuse. After the ceremony, I found myself standing outside, needing air and solitude. The sun was setting, painting the sky gold like Ethan's favorite roses. I thought about the morning I'd received that credit card alert, how my world had shattered with a single notification about a honeymoon booking. That moment had revealed not just Marcus's infidelity, but the intricate web of deception and crime that had ultimately cost our son his life. But from that shattering had come something else: purpose, community, change. Ethan's death had been senseless, preventable, cruel, but his life, even cut short at 17, had sparked a movement that saved thousands of others. He'd wanted to be a doctor, to heal people. In the end, he'd done something even more powerful. He'd shown us all what it meant to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. She'd attached a photo from her clinic, a wall covered with thank you notes from young patients who'd gotten clean. In the center was a framed photo of Ethan, smiling in his basketball uniform, with a plaque beneath it, in memory of Ethan Chen, who showed us that courage is doing the right thing, even when you're afraid. I smiled through tears, remembering my son not as a victim, but as a hero. Marcus had thought he was escaping to paradise with his mistress and his drug money. Instead, he'd created a legacy of shame and imprisonment. But Ethan, my brave, brilliant boy, had created a legacy of hope and healing that would outlive us all. As I drove home through the Boston evening, I passed the exit for Brookline, for the house where we'd once been a family. I didn't live there anymore, had sold it to a young family who'd promised to fill it with laughter again. My new apartment was smaller, simpler, with just enough space for my memories and my work. On the walls were photos of Ethan, newspaper clippings about Ethan's law, letters from families whose lives had been saved. It wasn't the life I'd planned. When I'd married Marcus, when I'd had Ethan, I'd imagined growing old surrounded by grandchildren, celebrating anniversaries and achievements. Instead, I was alone but not lonely, grieving but not broken, angry but channeling that anger into action. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, another surgery to perform, another family to counsel, another battle in the war against prescription drug fraud. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of peace. Ethan was gone, Marcus was imprisoned, and the life I'd known was over. But in its place had grown something unexpected, a purpose bigger than my pain, a community forged in shared loss, and the knowledge that one 17-year-old boy's courage had changed the world. The paradise Marcus had sought with his blood money, and his mistress had turned to ash. But the future Ethan had died trying to protect, one where young people were safe from prescription drug abuse, where doctors honored their oaths, where speaking truth to power was valued over silence. That future was slowly, painfully, beautifully being born. And that was the only eulogy that really mattered. 10 years had passed since that morning, in the funeral home, when a credit card notification revealed the depth of my husband's betrayal. A decade since I'd discovered that while I was choosing flowers for our son's casket, Marcus was booking a honeymoon suite with the woman who'd orchestrated his descent into crime. The pain had dulled to a chronic ache, like an old injury that flared up in bad weather, but the purpose born from that pain had only grown stronger. I stood in my office at the Victoria Chen Center for Medical Ethics, looking out at the Boston skyline. The center, established with funds from the victims' restitution settlement and private donations, had become a leading institution for training healthcare professionals in ethical prescribing practices. On my desk sat the morning's case files, each one representing a family touched by prescription fraud, each one a reminder of why this work mattered. Dr. Chen, my assistant knocked softly. "Your 10 o'clock is here." It's the journalist from the Washington Post. The journalist, a young woman named Sarah Martinez, had been investigating a new wave of prescription fraud schemes that seemed to be learning from the mistakes of the past. She'd reached out specifically because these new operations appeared to be avoiding the patterns that Ethan's evidence had helped law enforcement recognize. "Thank you for seeing me, Dr. Chen," Sarah said, as she settled into the chair across from my desk. "I know these interviews can be difficult." "They're necessary," I replied. "What have you found?" Sarah pulled out her tablet, swiping through documents and charts. "We've identified at least 12 new cases across the country. The perpetrators are being more careful now. They're not targeting doctors with obvious vulnerability. Instead, they're going after medical students, residents, young professionals who don't yet have the experience to recognize manipulation." I felt a familiar chill. "They're adapting, yes, and there's something else." Sarah hesitated, then pulled up a photograph. "This woman has appeared in connection with 3 of the cases, different names, different appearances, but facial recognition software confirms it's the same person. She goes by Natasha currently." The face on the screen was younger than Sofia Volkov had been, but there was something in the eyes, a calculating coldness that felt familiar. Another protégé, or had Sofia been training replacements even before her arrest? "Have you shared this with the FBI?" I asked. "That's why I'm here. Agent Wu suggested I speak with you first. She said you'd developed a profile system for identifying potential targets and perpetrators, that you might be able to help us understand how to stop this new wave before it gains momentum." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder, the product of years of research and analysis. After Ethan's death, I'd become obsessed with understanding how Marcus had been targeted, how he'd been so thoroughly manipulated that he'd chosen crime over his own son's life. What I'd discovered had formed the basis of our prevention programs. "The perpetrators look for specific combinations of traits," I explained, spreading charts across my desk. "Professional success, paired with personal dissatisfaction, financial pressure combined with ego vulnerability. They're essentially casting for a role, and they've become very good at identifying who will play it." Sarah studied the documents intently. "This is incredibly detailed. You've identified personality markers, life circumstances, even social media patterns that indicate vulnerability." "My son taught me the importance of documentation," I said quietly. "He prepared evidence even when facing death. The least I can do is use that lesson to prevent others from suffering the same fate." We spent the next 2 hours going through the patterns, the warning signs, the subtle ways these criminal organizations identified and groomed their targets. Sarah took meticulous notes, occasionally asking questions that showed she understood the complexity of the problem. "There's something else I need to tell you," she said as our meeting wound down. "One of the victims in Seattle, a young resident named Michael Torres, he tried to back out of the scheme. He went to the police, offered to cooperate. 2 days later, his wife received divorce papers and photos of him with another woman, photos that were clearly doctored, but convincing enough to destroy his credibility. They're not just learning from past mistakes," I realized. "They're adding blackmail and intimidation to their toolkit." Dr. Torres is in protective custody now, but his career is ruined. His marriage is in shambles. Even though he tried to do the right thing, he's lost everything. I thought of Ethan, of the price he'd paid for trying to do the right thing. The methods had evolved, but the core evil remained the same. Criminals who viewed medical professionals as tools to be used and discarded, who saw families as collateral damage in their pursuit of profit. After Sarah left, I had another appointment, this one unscheduled but not unexpected. Emma Patterson, now Dr. Patterson, and the director of our youth intervention program, appeared in my doorway with a familiar look of concern. "We have a situation," she said without preamble. "A medical student at Tufts, contacted the hotline. She thinks her boyfriend might be involved in something illegal. He's been pushing her to write prescriptions for friends who need help. How far has it gone? I asked, already reaching for my phone to alert our legal team. She hasn't written anything yet, but he's becoming insistent. She's scared, Victoria. She said he reminds her of the stories about Marcus, charming and loving one moment, manipulative and threatening the next. The parallels were painful but not surprising. In 10 years of running the center, we'd seen the same patterns repeat with minor variation. The criminals might adapt their methods, but the fundamental approach remained consistent: identify vulnerable medical professionals, establish emotional control, then leverage that control for illegal prescriptions. We need to get her somewhere safe, I said. If she's recognized the pattern and reached out, she's already in danger. They don't tolerate resistance. Emma nodded. I've arranged for her to come here this afternoon. But Victoria, there's something else. She mentioned that her boyfriend had talked about a mentor, someone who'd taught him how to identify the right kind of partners. The description sounds familiar. My blood ran cold. Sofia Volkov was supposed to be in federal prison for another 30 years, but she'd had associates, proteges, an entire network that had never been fully mapped. Was it possible that someone from that original organization was training a new generation? The medical student, Rebecca Chen, arrived looking terrified but determined. She was 25, brilliant, according to her professors, with the kind of empathy that would make her an excellent doctor if she survived this crisis. He seemed perfect at first, Rebecca said, clutching a cup of tea in our secure conference room. David was everything I thought I wanted: supportive of my career, understanding about my crazy hours, always there with encouragement when things got tough. When did things change? Emma asked gently. About 3 months in, he started mentioning friends who were struggling with chronic pain, how unfair it was that they couldn't get proper medication. He made it sound like a failing of the healthcare system, like I could be part of the solution. The grooming process was I'd seen it documented in dozens of cases, had taught seminars on recognizing the signs, but knowing the pattern and experiencing it were vastly different things. Rebecca had been living inside a carefully constructed manipulation, and extracting her safely would require delicate handling. Has he introduced you to any of these friends? I asked. One, a woman named Natasha. Emma and I exchanged glances. The same name Sarah Martinez had mentioned. The pieces were connecting in ways that suggested a coordinated operation, one that had learned from the destruction of the previous network. Rebecca, I said carefully, you've been very brave coming here. But I need you to understand the danger you're in. These people have killed to protect their operations. My son died because he tried to expose them. Rebecca's eyes widened. You're that Dr. Chen. I've read about Ethan, about what he did. We studied the case in our medical ethics class. Then you know this isn't just about prescription fraud. It's about an organization that views people like us as resources to be exploited. And they don't let those resources go easily. We spent the next several hours developing a safety plan for Rebecca. She would cooperate with law enforcement, but carefully, with protection in place. Her boyfriend David would be investigated, but subtly to avoid alerting him or his associates. Most importantly, she would disappear from his life in a way that seemed natural, a family emergency that required her to leave town immediately. As we arranged the details, I couldn't help but think about the evolution of these crimes. When Marcus had been recruited, the approach had been straightforward: seduce, manipulate, exploit. But this new generation had learned from those failures. They were more careful, more sophisticated, more willing to use violence and intimidation from the start. That evening, I attended a memorial service that had become an annual tradition. Every year, on the anniversary of Ethan's death, Ethan's army gathered to remember those we'd lost and celebrate those we'd saved. The venue had grown from a small church basement to a large auditorium, reflecting the expansion of our movement. Linda Harrison, who'd become one of my closest friends despite the tragic circumstances of our meeting, sat beside me as family after family shared their stories. Some spoke of loved ones lost to overdoses from illegally prescribed pills. Others talked about children who'd found recovery through our programs. Each story was a thread in the tapestry of pain and purpose that defined our work. This year's keynote speaker was someone I'd never expected to see at our gathering. Thomas Morrison, the detective who'd first investigated Ethan's death, had brought his grandson Danny. The young man, now 5 years sober and in his junior year of college, spoke movingly about how Ethan's sacrifice had saved his life. "I never met Ethan Chen," Danny said from the podium, "but he's been with me every day of my recovery. When I wanted to use, I thought about a kid my age who died trying to stop the people who were supplying my pills. When recovery got hard, I remembered that he faced down death rather than stay silent. I'm alive because Ethan Chen had more courage at 17 than most people show in a lifetime." After the service, I was approached by someone I didn't recognize. An older man with the careful movements of someone carrying heavy secrets. He introduced himself as Robert Kim, a retired pharmacist from Providence. "Dr. Chen, I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "Something I should have said years ago. I knew Marcus, not well, but professionally. And I saw things, suspicious prescriptions, patterns that didn't make sense. I should have reported it, but I was afraid. Afraid for my job, my license, my reputation." I studied his face, seeing the guilt that had clearly haunted him for years. "We all make choices, Mr. Kim. What matters is what we do going forward. That's why I'm here. I want to help. I've been tracking prescription patterns in Rhode Island, documenting suspicious activities. I think I've identified at least 3 doctors who might be involved in this new network you're investigating." He handed me a flash drive, his hands shaking slightly. "Everything I've found is on here. Names, prescription records, pattern analysis. I can't undo my silence from before, but maybe I can prevent another Ethan from dying." I accepted the drive, understanding the courage it had taken for him to come forward. Guilt was a powerful motivator, but transforming it into action required strength that not everyone possessed. Back at the center that night, I reviewed Robert Kim's data with my team. The patterns were subtle but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Prescriptions written just below the threshold that would trigger automatic reviews. Patients who existed on paper but had no other medical history. Addresses that traced back to vacant lots or abandoned buildings. "This is sophisticated," said Dr. James Liu, our data analyst. "They're using AI to optimize their prescription patterns, keeping just below detection threshold. It's like they have a playbook for avoiding every safeguard we've put in place." "Then we need to be smarter," I replied. "Ethan's law was a good start, but it's clearly not enough. We need to think like they think. Anticipate their adaptation." We worked through the night, developing new algorithms to detect the subtle patterns Robert Kim had identified. By morning, we had a preliminary system that could flag suspicious prescription networks with greater accuracy than existing methods. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step toward staying ahead of the criminals who continued to evolve their tactics. The next day brought an unexpected visitor to the center. Agent Rachel Wu, now Deputy Director of the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division, arrived with a security detail and a grim expression. "Victoria, we have a problem," she said once we were in my secure office. "Sofia Volkov was attacked in prison yesterday. She survived, but barely. And before she lost consciousness, she said something that concerns us." "What did she say?" "She said the student has become the master. Then she asked for you specifically. She says she'll only talk to you, that she has information about the new network that could save lives." I felt a chill run down my spine. In 10 years, I'd never spoken to Sofia Volkov directly. She was the architect of my son's death, the puppet master who'd turned Marcus into a criminal. The thought of being in the same room with her made my skin crawl. "Why would she want to talk to me?" I asked. "We think she's scared. Whoever attacked her was sending a message. The new network doesn't want her talking, which means she knows something valuable, but she says she'll only share it with you, face to face." Agent Wu, that woman orchestrated the destruction of my family. She manipulated my husband into becoming a drug dealer. Her actions led directly to my son's murder, and now she wants to chat. "I understand you're reluctant, but Victoria, If she has information that could prevent other families from suffering what you went through, don't we have an obligation to listen? The words echoed Ethan's philosophy. His insistence that good people couldn't remain silent in the face of evil. But this felt different. This felt like being asked to negotiate with the devil herself. I spent the rest of the day wrestling with the decision. Emma, Linda, and the rest of my team offered support, but recognized that the choice had to be mine. As I sat in my office that evening, surrounded by photos of Ethan and letters from families we'd helped, I realized that my personal feelings couldn't override the potential to save lives. "I'll do it," I told Agent Wu the next morning, "but on my terms. Maximum security, full recording, and a guarantee that nothing she says can be used to reduce her sentence." The meeting was arranged for the following week at the federal medical facility where Sophia was recovering. As I flew to Minnesota, I thought about all the questions I'd wanted to ask her over the years. Why Marcus? Why Ethan? How did she live with herself knowing the destruction she'd caused? But when I finally sat across from Sofia Volkov in that sterile prison interview room, I felt only a cold determination to extract whatever information might save future victims. She looked older, grayer, with a bandage covering part of her face from the attack, but her eyes remained sharp, calculating, even in her weakened state. "Dr. Chen," she said, her accent faint but noticeable, "thank you for coming. I know this must be difficult. Tell me what you know about the new network," I said, refusing to engage in pleasantries with my son's killer. She smiled slightly, expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Straight to business. I respected that about you. Even from afar, your son inherited that quality." "Don't you dare speak about my son." The smile faded. "You're right, I apologize. Let me be direct. The new network isn't new. It's the evolution of what we built. Run by people I trained but who've surpassed my methods. They've learned from our mistakes, adapted to your countermeasures, and they're far more ruthless than we ever were. Why should I believe you? Why help us now? Because they tried to kill me. Because I'm already serving life without parole, and because Dr. Chen, I'm tired. 10 years in this place gives you time to think. I won't insult you by claiming remorse, but I can offer you information." She proceeded to detail the structure of the new organization, names, methods, and most crucially their next target. They were planning something she called the Harvest, a coordinated effort to compromise 50 medical professionals across the country simultaneously, creating a flood of illegal prescriptions that would overwhelm law enforcement's ability to respond. "They've been placing operatives for 2 years," she explained. "Your Rebecca Chen is just one of many. By my count, at least 40 medical students and residents are currently in relationships with network operatives. When they graduate, when they have full prescribing privileges, that's when the harvest begins." The scope was staggering. If Sophia was telling the truth, we were facing a criminal operation that dwarfed the original network. Thousands of lives hung in the balance. "Why target medical students?" I asked. "Your operation went after established doctors, because you changed the game. Ethan's law made it harder to compromise experienced doctors, so they adapted. Get them young while they're still forming professional habits. Make the corruption seem normal, even noble. By the time they realize what they're involved in, they're too deep to escape." I documented everything she told me. Names, dates, locations, methods. Some of it aligned with what we'd already discovered, some of it revealed connections we'd missed. All of it painted a picture of a criminal evolution that had learned from past failures. "There's one more thing," Sophia said, as our time ran out. "The woman you're looking for, Natasha, she's not just an operative. She's the architect of the new network. And Dr. Chen, she studied you, your methods, your programs, your successes. She knows how you think, how you operate. She's designed the Harvest specifically to counter everything you've built." As guards prepared to return Sophia to her cell, she made one final comment. "Your son would be proud of what you've become. I know that means nothing coming from me, but it's true. He changed you from a surgeon who saved individual lives to a warrior who protects thousands. That transformation, that's his true legacy. I left the prison feeling sullied, but informed. Sofia Volkov remained a monster, but she'd provided intelligence that could save countless lives. On the flight back to Boston, I called an emergency meeting of our task force. We had work to do. The next 6 months were a blur of activity. Using Sophia's intelligence combined with our own research and Robert Kim's data, we identified 37 of the suspected 50 targets. Working with the FBI and DEA, we developed intervention strategies that wouldn't alert the network to our knowledge of their plan. The operations had to be delicate. We couldn't simply arrest the operatives without evidence of crimes committed. Instead, we had to extract the medical students and residents safely while building cases against their handler. It was like performing surgery on a tumor that had wrapped itself around vital organs, requiring precision and patience. Rebecca Chen became one of our key assets. Her boyfriend David had introduced her to more network members, unknowingly providing us with intelligence about the organization's structure. She wore wires, documented conversations, and played the role of the eager but cautious medical student perfectly. The breakthrough came when David, growing impatient with Rebecca's hesitation to write prescriptions, made a critical error. He introduced her to Natasha directly, hoping the architect of the network could convince her to cooperate. The meeting took place in an upscale Boston restaurant, with FBI agents at nearby tables and full surveillance in place. Natasha turned out to be younger than expected, perhaps early 30s, with an intensity that reminded me painfully of Sofia Volkov in her prime. Through Rebecca's wire, we heard Natasha lay out the network's philosophy with chilling clarity. The medical system is broken, she told Rebecca. Patients suffer because of arbitrary restrictions on necessary medications. We're not criminal, we're humanitarian entrepreneurs, connecting suffering people with the relief they need. It was a seductive argument, carefully crafted to appeal to medical students' desire to help patients. Natasha presented prescription fraud as a form of civil disobedience, a noble response to an unjust system. She never mentioned the overdoses, the destroyed families, the teenagers like Ethan, who died trying to stop them. Rebecca played her part perfectly, asking just enough questions to seem interested, but cautious. By the end of the dinner, Natasha had revealed key details about the harvest's timeline and structure, confident that she'd recruited another asset. That night, we had what we needed to begin dismantling the network. But we faced a dilemma. Moving too early would save some victims but allow others to scatter. Waiting too long risked the harvest beginning before we could stop it. It was the kind of decision that kept me awake, knowing that lives hung in the balance of our timing. In the end, it was another unexpected ally who helped us resolve the dilemma. Marcus, from his federal prison cell, sent word through his lawyer that he wanted to help. He'd heard about the new network through prison channels and claimed to have information about vulnerabilities in their operations. My first instinct was to refuse. Marcus had lost any right to involvement in fighting the crimes he'd once committed. But Agent Wu convinced me to at least hear what he had to offer. The video conference with Marcus was surreal. He looked older, grayer, diminished by a decade in prison, but when he spoke about the network's operational methods, his knowledge was clearly valuable. "They're making the same mistake I did," he said, not quite meeting my eyes through the camera. "They're keeping digital records of everything, thinking encryption makes them safe, but they're using the same systems we did, with the same vulnerability." He provided technical details about the network's communication systems, weaknesses that our cyber team confirmed could be exploited. It was actionable intelligence that could allow us to map the entire network before moving against it. "Why are you helping us?" I asked when he'd finished his technical briefing. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Because I think about Ethan every day. Because I know that nothing I do will ever make up for letting him die. But maybe I can help save someone else's kid. It's not redemption. I know that. It's something I ended the call without responding to his emotional plea. His information was useful, but his motivations were irrelevant to me. Marcus had made his choices long ago, and their consequences were his to bear. Using Marcus's intelligence combined with our other sources, we mapped the entire Harvest network, 53 medical professionals in various stages of recruitment, 47 handlers, like David, 15 mid-level coordinators, and at the top, Natasha and 2 others, running an operation that spanned the continent. The takedown was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Coordinated across 14 cities, we called it Operation Rising Sun, in honor of Ethan's love for yellow roses and new beginning. 500 federal agents, supported by local law enforcement, and our civilian advisors, would move simultaneously to prevent any warnings from spreading through the network. I watched from the FBI command center in Boston as the operation unfolded. On dozens of screens, agents moved in on targets, serving warrants, making arrests, seizing evidence. Some suspects came quietly, others tried to run or destroy evidence, but the coordination was flawless, the result of months of planning. The medical students and residents were extracted first, many genuinely shocked to learn the true nature of their relationships. Support teams were ready with counseling, legal advice, and protection for those who needed it. Watching these young professionals realize they'd been groomed for criminal exploitation reminded me painfully of Marcus's journey, but also strengthened my resolve to prevent others from following that path. David was arrested at the apartment he'd shared with Rebecca, his laptop containing enough evidence to ensure a lengthy prison sentence. He seemed genuinely confused, as if he couldn't understand how his careful plans had failed. The network had taught him to see medical professionals as easy marks, but they'd underestimated the strength of those who chose integrity over corruption. Natasha's arrest was more dramatic. Warned somehow that agents were coming, she attempted to flee, leading to a chase through Boston's financial district, but there was nowhere to run. When cornered, she turned to face the agents, with a smile that chilled me even through the surveillance footage. "You think you've won," she said as they cuffed her, "but you've only delayed the inevitable. The demand exists, the suppliers will adapt. This war doesn't end with me." She was right. Of course, the prescription drug crisis wasn't solved by dismantling one network, no matter how sophisticated, but each victory saved lives, protected families, and bought time to strengthen our defenses against the next threat. In the aftermath of Operation Rising Sun, we worked to support the victims and build cases against the perpetrators. 43 medical professionals were successfully extracted from the network before they could be fully compromised. Hundreds of planned illegal prescriptions were prevented. Thousands of potential overdoses were avoided. But the real victory came in what we learned. Each arrested operative provided intelligence about methods, targets, and vulnerabilities. Each rescued medical professional shared their story, helping us refine our prevention programs. The network had evolved, but so had we. 6 months after Operation Rising Sun, I stood once again in the auditorium where we held our annual memorial service. This year's gathering was the largest yet, with families from across the country joining either in person or virtually. The stories shared reflected both our losses and our victories, the ongoing nature of a fight that had become my life's work. Emma spoke about the success of our early intervention programs, how teaching medical students to recognize grooming tactics had prevented dozens of recruitment. Linda Harrison announced the expansion of our victim support services to 3 new states, and Robert Kim, the pharmacist whose guilt had driven him to become one of our most effective analysts, presented data showing a significant drop in prescription fraud following our operation. But the most moving moment came when Rebecca Chen took the stage. She'd completed her medical degree, despite the trauma of her experience, and had chosen to specialize in addiction medicine. Her story of recognition, resistance, and recovery embodied everything we fought for. Ethan Chen, Saved my life, she said, emotion thick in her voice, not directly, but through the programs and protections built in his name. When I realized I was being groomed for criminal activity, I knew where to turn because of Ethan's army. When I was scared to come forward, I found courage in his example, and now, as I begin my career as a physician, I carry his legacy forward in every prescription I write, every patient I treat, every young doctor I mentor about integrity and ethics. As the service concluded, I found myself standing at Ethan's memorial wall, a new addition to the center where families could leave messages for those lost to prescription drug crimes. The wall was covered with notes, photos, and mementos, each representing a life cut short by greed and corruption. I touched Ethan's photo, the one from his junior year where he was laughing at something off camera. So full of life and possibility, 27 years of life, 10 years of death, and a legacy that grew stronger each day. Mom, I need to tell you something. I could still hear his voice from that last letter, the boy who'd refused to stay silent, who'd gathered evidence even as danger closed in, who'd chosen justice over safety. He'd shown us all what courage looked like, and we'd built something powerful from the foundation of his sacrifice. That night, I returned to my apartment to find a package waiting. No return address, but the contents made the sender clear. Inside was a single yellow rose, and a note. Thank you for not letting them win. From someone else's Ethan. I placed the rose in water, and sat down to write my daily report, documenting the day's victories and challenges, preparing for tomorrow's battles. The war against prescription fraud would continue, evolving and adapting just as we did, but armed with the lessons learned from tragedy, strengthened by the community forged in shared loss, and inspired by a 17-year-old's courage, we would continue to fight. Marcus remained in prison, serving his life sentence, and occasionally providing intelligence when new threats emerged. His paradise with Sophia had been an illusion, a criminal fantasy that had cost him everything real and valuable in his life. He would die behind bars, remembered not as a successful doctor or loving father, but as a cautionary tale about the price of choosing greed over family. Sophia Volkov had survived the attack in prison, but spent her remaining days in solitary confinement, isolated from the criminal network she'd helped create. Her proteges had surpassed her in brutality but not in success, their harvest prevented by the very programs she'd inadvertently inspired through her crimes. And somewhere, in medical schools and hospitals across the country, young doctors were learning to recognize the signs of recruitment, to resist the sophisticated manipulations of criminal networks, to choose integrity, even when it was dangerous. They studied Ethan's case, understood the real-world consequences of prescription fraud, and committed to being part of the solution rather than the problem. As I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with a message from Agent Wood. New intelligence suggested another network forming in the Southwest, learning from the failures of those who'd come before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to investigate and prevent. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Ethan had been gone for 10 years, but his impact grew daily. Every prevented overdose, every rescued medical student, every family spared the grief I carried. They were all part of his legacy. He'd wanted to be a doctor to save lives. Instead, he'd become something more. A symbol of courage that inspired others to stand against corruption. A catalyst for change that protected thousands. A son whose integrity lit the way for those who came after. The paradise Marcus had sought with his blood money, and Mistress had crumbled to ash, but the future Ethan had envisioned, one where medical professionals honored their oaths, and patients were protected from exploitation. That future was being built one victory at a time. It wasn't paradise, but it was progress, and for a grieving mother who'd turned pain into purpose, that was enough. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.